Habakkuk 2. Shall not all these take up their taunt against him with scoffing and riddles for him and say, quote, woe to him who heaps up what is not his own. For how long? And loads himself with pledges. Will not your debtors suddenly arise, and those awake who will make you tremble? Then you will be spoil for them, because you have plundered many nations. All the remnant of the peoples shall plunder you for the blood of man and violence to the earth, to cities and all who dwell in them. Woe to him who gets evil gain for his house, to set his nest on high, to be safe from the reach of harm. You have devised shame for your house by cutting off many peoples. You have forfeited your life. For the stone will cry out from the wall, and the beam from the woodwork respond. Woe to him who builds a town with blood and founds a city on iniquity. Behold, is it not from the Lord of hosts that peoples labor merely for fire, and nations weary themselves for nothing? For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the seas. Woe to him who makes his neighbors drink. You pour out your wrath and make them drunk in order to gaze at their nakedness. You will have your fill of shame instead of glory. Drink yourself and show your uncircumcision. The cup in the Lord's right hand will come around to you, and utter shame will come upon your glory. Then the violence done to Lebanon will overwhelm you, as will the destruction of the beasts that terrified them, for the blood of man and violence to the earth, the cities and all who dwell in them. What profit is an idol when its maker has shaped it, a metal image, a teacher of lies? For its maker trusts in his own creation when he makes speechless idols. Woe to him who says to a wooden thing, awake, to a silent stone, arise. Can this teach? Behold, it is overlaid with gold and silver, and there is no breath at all in it. But the Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before him. What we just read is a very, very epic part of the Bible. This is a woe oracle, okay? You see that repetition of the word woe. And a lot of people, in my experience, are very much shy away from the prophets because of passages like this. We're like, what on earth is going on? The pronouns are confusing. Who's the thee and the them and the he and the him? But let me show you that why we actually don't need to be scared of Old Testament woe oracles, particularly because we've been following the narrative behind Habakkuk. It has looked a little bit like this. Just look at your screens briefly. If you've tracked with us through the book, Habakkuk is a dialogue between this prophet and Yahweh. And it begins with Habakkuk having a complaint. God, how long do I have to wait for you to execute justice? And then the book is moving this way, that we get Yahweh giving an answer, which is to say the Chaldean army is coming. We've looked at that. And now after that, Habakkuk has a second complaint, which is this: how can you use wickedness to accomplish your purpose? And that has moved us to the center of the book, which we looked at yesterday, which is this: the righteous one shall live by faith, or the righteous shall live by faith, which is really at the center of the book of Habakkuk. That's important because that helps us with what we just read, because look, wouldn't you know, the rest of the book looks like this. The rest of the book, after the center of the book, it's going to unfold literally along the same contours that it already has followed. So this is kind of the sweetness of the literature of Habakkuk. So right after the center, the righteous will live by faith, which is in the middle of the book, we're going to get God's answer to the complaint, which is that wickedness will be punished. Remember, Habakkuk had that question. And then we're going to get a picture parallel to the coming of the Chaldean army. We're going to get a parallel picture here, primarily see this tomorrow, of the coming of the armies of God. And then Habakkuk is going to have a resolution in line with his first complaint. Okay, this is where our thing falls this morning, which is God's going to give an answer to that question of, are you just going to let wickedness happen forever, God? Okay, and the answer is no, God is not going to let wickedness happen forever. Can God use wickedness to accomplish his purpose? That's the parallel question to what we're looking at, and our passage is here. So with that a little bit longer introduction, let's look at the text itself. This is an Old Testament prophetic woe oracle, okay? And probably most obvious, we get this repetition 5 times of the word woe. I bet you were going to say that, Brian, but I stole that observation. So you'll have to offer a different one. But 5 times, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, we get this repetition of a pronouncement of woe or judgment. What else you notice, Brian?
Yeah, I think one of the repeated ideas is the kind of content of woe is woe for what you're doing. Here's going to be the result. Here's what's going to come for doing those things. So usually the first verse in that stanza is what'd you do, woe for you doing this, and then the rest of it is the result of that, the consequence.
Okay, that's helpful. So there's a woe because of this action, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then there's a action consequence rhythm.
Yeah.
I think that's fair. Yeah, I think that's kind of the formula of a woe oracle. It's kind of maybe a type of genre that we're not real familiar with, but yeah, that would follow just, like when you write a letter, there's a certain, common standard. I think that would be the standard of a woe oracle. We see this other places in the Bible. Yeah. And how did you say that, Brian? What you did and what the consequence is? Would that be a fair way to say that?
Yeah. And I think that what's interesting is the consequence is very related. It's very much the thing that you did is going to come back on you.
That's right.
What you reaped or what you sowed, you're going to reap. So you've heaped up these pledges. In other words, you've forced these people to become indebted to you,
right.
And then they're going to come up, they're going to rise up, and you're going to become spoiled for them. They're going to take your stuff. You plundered many nations. Well, now they're going to plunder you. Like the very thing you were doing is coming back on you now.
Yeah, and that's a really critical thing to see, I think, about this. Yeah, so there's a declaration of woe, right? That's a him who, right? Him who, and him who. Okay, that in other words, that's a declaration of this is what you have done, but this is what is coming as a result of the reason that's for what you've done, and then the result of it. That's a declaration of woe. Yeah, and I think that's important to see because remember, this is answering that question of God, what's going on with all of this wickedness that you're going to see in Judah, okay? And the Chaldean army is going to come and judge Judah. But then Habakkuk had that second question, which is, well, and how can you do that? Is this wickedness of the Babylonian just going to keep on going on and on and on and on and on forever? Yeah. Okay? And that's helpful to see. And the answer is no, but it's just extended. It's extended no.
And I think what it's starting to describe is that justice will be done. Like the Old Testament standard, an eye for an eye, is to say that the punishment or the consequence for a wrongdoing was appropriately balanced with the act. So if you did sort of a quote unquote small wrong, there was a small punishment. If you did a big wrong, there was a big punishment. And so I think what he's saying here is, look, God is going to be consistent in his judgment of these people. They've done these horrendous things. Well, horrendous things are going to happen to them, which if you could look into the future, then is why it's, the gospel of grace is so scandalous, because it flips all that on its head.
That's right. Okay. Yeah. So that's a helpful thing what you're saying. So eye for an eye is often, people misunderstand that as a pronouncement of vengeance. What you're saying, it's actually limiting the amount of retribution you can take depending. It should be appropriate to how you've been wronged. And you're saying God is actually the one who arbitrates that and sees that, even on the level of nations. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's helpful. Brian, let's talk about the actual woes themselves. Maybe we can just get into them a little bit. So what is it that Babylon seems to be doing that God is going to judge them for? So in other words, if this is kind of a list of charges, maybe, God's answer here is that this is a taunt, okay? And we could see this. Taunt against him, that him is Babylon. That's the him. That's this wicked nation that's coming in, and they will plunder Judah, and they're going to take people off into captivity, right? That evil thing is going to happen. We tend to think the Babylonian exile, if you weren't, 586 BC, if you're just joining us, that's probably when we would date the actual siege of God's people and the exile for Babylon. What are some of the things that they're doing that we can understand if we just do some textual work here? Maybe we'll start with this first woe, 1 of 5. What is it talking about? What's the significance of 6, 7, and 8 What's the crime? What's the consequence? What does it seem like these people are up to? Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, I think the loads himself with pledges. He heaps up with what is not his own.
Yeah.
It seems like, certainly we talked about that they're just taking, they're taking these towns, they're taking these dwelling places. We looked at that, I think, yesterday. So they're just taking people's places. I think that heaps or loads himself up with pledges sort of makes me think of like they're making these people indebted to them, perhaps like, hey, if you provide this much money, we'll let you go or give back to you what's yours or something like that. The idea in verse 7, the debtors raising up, there's this unfair, indebting, making them indebted going on here.
I put theft, plunder. I don't know if that's an appropriate thing to say in what you're.
Yeah, and certainly verse 8, there's
not
that
his
word,
own.
You have plundered.
Plundered many nations. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So this is a people group who literally goes around pillaging and destroying other countries and then setting up shop and calling them theirs.
And the second one starts to elaborate on that here he, the Babylon, he is getting this gain for his own house, but it's like this sense that he has devastated these other people to provide security for himself, like to set his nest on high there in verse 9, to be safe from the reach of harm. Like, it's like, haha, like now I'm safe because all of you are dead,
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, so cutting off of many people.
I'm putting it as theft and plunder is probably, and I know these are all related, but if you were to describe Babylon and what is the pronouncement against them is woe number one, this idea of heaping up, there's imagery, okay? There's imagery that is getting at these people they're of theft and plundering nations. And then in woe 2, verse 9, it says charge number 2 here is that sort of plunder is that of greed, but they're using that to set themselves up in a secure way. Is that right?
Yeah.
Fortified your life, but it's taking other people's things, to create literally walls of security. So if you know anything about the Babylonian Empire, you can think of like a watchtower and a wall. People would think that they had a wall that you could fit 5 chariots wide. That's just the wall's width that you could ride around their fortified cities. And they're saying they've built that from stealing from other people. Okay. So you have theft, plunder, security, greed. What about this verse 12 one? Now they're building up their towns again in verse 12, but I don't know if there's a particular charge here.
Yeah, well, certainly that it's this founding on iniquity. And I think the 13, the consequence might help us to understand, what's uniquely going on there. I had a thought on this earlier. It's just not coming back to me at the moment. It's not.
Well, it does seem like it is. There's a society that is built up on iniquity.
Yeah.
And you can't necessarily build a society on iniquity.
Oh, yeah. I remember what. So they're founding this city. They're building this town. I don't know if this is a stretch, but the history of Babylon goes all the way back to the Tower of Babel, which was the city that was built, or this tower that was built as a monument to their own glory. And I wonder if what God is doing is that, that there's all that pride language from the other passages. I wonder if there's some connections with that, because in the consequence, God is saying, like, this is going to amount to nothing. Like your big city, your big walls, all this stuff, it's not going to amount to anything. Instead, verse 14, what's going to fill the earth is not your name, it's the Lord's.
That's right. Right. Yeah, that's right. And what you're pointing out there is, interestingly, now we can probably divide the woes into 2 sections, because we have, structurally, the way this breaks down, it seems like we got 3 woes, right? 1, 2, 3. And then we have this declaration, I suppose, of the Lord and who He is, or
right.
the purpose, the triumphant purpose of God. Yeah, that's right. There's that. And again, we're going to get that again in verse 20, right? For we get this conjunction, for, but, and then down here we got that contrasting language of but. So again, even among this section, we could say that there maybe is part 1 of the woes. Theft, plunder, security, greed, this idea of building a city on iniquity, sort of just the foundation of society. And then we get this break now to talking about that the earth is going to be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. Wonderful thing we should come back to talk
Right.
about in a minute. What do you make of verse 15? What
Yeah,
seems to
I
be
mean,
the accusation there?
yeah, I mean, it seems like the repetition of shame, and kind of the nakedness imagery,
Yeah.
the drunkenness imagery, they're almost seems like there's a bait and switch kind of thing going on. Like, oh, here,
Yeah.
have some wine, but they get them too drunk, and then they just
Makes his
strip them and
neighbors
shame
drink.
them.
Yeah. Let's call that extortion.
Yeah, it's a good summary word for it.
Yeah, the idea of extorting other people. In other words, here you go, but it's really for your sort of self
Right.
benefit. Yeah. Doing violence, but also this repetition of this word drink.
Mm-hmm.
Oh dear, we just got a little bit of a problem here. We're coming back online. This idea of here, we have this where you're to make your neighbor drink, and he says, drink yourself.
Yeah.
Right.
And right in verse 16 there, you get that little kind of tagline: "The cup in the Lord's right hand will come around you, or come around to you." Like that pops up in Isaiah, and then certainly, we see it in the Garden of Gethsemane. If this cup can pass from me,
That
the
Jesus
cup of
takes
God's
that cup.
wrath.
Yeah. That's the image that is most commonly used to describe the wrath of God, is that of a cup that is filled up, that someone has to drink. So
right. So
this idea of making them drink, pouring out your wrath on other people.
Yeah. And I think then, and utter shame will come upon your glory. Like, it's just a full reversal of what they're trying to do. They're puffed up, they're proud, and they're boasting in their own glory, their own strength, their justice comes from themselves. And now he says, your utter shame will come upon your glory.
Will come upon you. Yeah. And this last one, seems a little bit clearer here, but this one seems to be idolatry.
Mm-hmm.
This last woe in verse 19, to him who says to a wooden thing, awake.
Yeah.
And a silent stone, arise. So I don't know if that's a fair summary. I know those are all interrelated categories. Theft, plunder, greed for the sake of personal security, a society built on iniquity and pride, extortion of others, and idolatry. Those are the charges. But what you've already pointed out, Brian, is that inherent in all of these, Habakkuk's question is, are you just going to let this wicked thing happen ongoing? And the answer is no, but God doesn't say no. What he seems to say is, in this woe oracle, inherent in the thing of wickedness is that it's going to come back on you.
Right.
Which is really amazing to see that. So let's talk about theft and plunder in this idea. It seems like the judgment, at least one of the judgments of Babylon, one aspect of judgment, is the wicked thing you're doing comes back to mock you.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And I don't know, maybe let's talk about that. How does that actually happen? So they've plundered many nations, but what's going to happen is they're going to be plundered.
Yeah.
That would correspond to verse 6. Go ahead.
It's the very people that they indebted or plundered. It's the very people that are going to turn around and do this back to them.
Right. Yeah.
Because you plundered many nations, all the remnant of the people shall plunder you. So at some point, the people that are left, that you left alive, will turn around and conquer you.
That's right. And we actually know that the Babylonian Empire does fall.
Right.
God is going to execute judgment. So in a way, God is saying the instrument of his judgment against Judah is also marked for judgment, because God is the judge of the world.
Yeah.
Wow. But I think it's instructive here, Brian. I think one of the principles we're seeing is that a part of how God executes his judgment is built into the wickedness. I don't know if that makes sense. It reminds me of Romans 1 a little bit. God says, go ahead, see how it works out for you.
Right.
In that sense, plunder comes back to plunder you. What about verse 9? How does he say that? You've devised shame. Look at what it says in verse 9, 10, and 11. This is really interesting. And we could talk about this image in verse 11. It says, the stone will cry out from the wall.
Right.
And the beam from the woodwork is going to respond. What is that a picture of?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, certainly it's this idea that they're building this house, on, the blood, basically, of these people. And that very thing will cry out to them. Now, I think, down the road, the cities will get conquered. The Babylonian cities will get conquered, invaded, etc., and they'll they'll be torn down.
Yeah. Yep, that's right. So literally, it's almost like it reminds me of like the blood of this innocent person cries
Yeah.
out against you. There's this imagery
Yeah.
of you've used injustice to build your city. It's almost like the city is going to come back and cry out and kind of be the prosecuting attorney, against you. Even verse 12 again, it seems as if the Lord of hosts is actually, verse 11, behold, is it not, verse 13, excuse me, from the Lord of hosts that people labor merely for fire and nations weary themselves for nothing. This idea of futility, right? Doing something of futility is a part of God's judgment that comes from God. And that's important to see.
Like you're gonna, murder and kill all these people, cause so much devastation, to make a name for yourself, and it will not last.
Right. Yeah. It's definitely the language of mockery, which is why it's called a taunt in the beginning. They have all these things. Every single woe has an element of it's going to mock you, right? I mean, verse 16 has that. You're going to actually have your fill of shame. You're making other people drunk. You're going to end up drinking. Not to mention the cup of God's wrath will surround you. Utter shame will come upon your glory. Man, very strong imagery. And then, of course, idolatry. Let's talk about idolatry a little bit. This is a mockery of people who don't, verse 19 and on, who don't worship Yahweh, but they worship other things. And he says, imagine, it's kind of like saying to this wooden thing, wake up, and a silent stone, arise. And it's like, this thing can't do anything for you. It has no breath in it, right? That's a mockery of when you worship things other than the living God.
Well, I think the repetition in that section of the all the speech words is really interesting. It's a teacher of lies in verse 18, but it's a speechless idol. So it's this teacher, but it can't even talk.
No breath in it.
He's speaking to, it's got no breath in it, and that the maker is speaking to it. You should do these things, and then teach me. And all that then stands in contrast to verse 20. The Lord is sitting in the temple, and the whole earth shuts up.
That's awesome.
That they're worshiping cannot speak, and here the Lord is just ruling and reigning, the actual God. And everybody else has to remain silent before him.
That's sweet. So we're seeing here a couple principles. One, evil, a part of God's judgment, certainly is retributive, like God's wrath will come upon you because he's the judge of the world. But also one of the ways that God's wrath comes is inherently in the evil thing. It backfires. Okay.
Right.
Wickedness backfiring. Idolatry is stupid. We see that. I mean, it's actually absurd and it is mocked.
Right.
Okay. That's the other one. But let's talk about these, verse 14 and verse 20. What are we learning about God in Habakkuk chapter 2 here from this? God is doing this taunt. He's mocking this wicked nation that he is going to use to judge his people. So the answer is yes, he can use wickedness. But remember, one of these questions is, aren't you of pure eyes tend to look on wickedness? Are you holy? And the God answer is, yeah, God is in his holy temple.
Yeah.
And one of the ways he showcases his holiness is this mockery of idolatry.
Yeah.
What other things do we learn about God?
So there's just a sort of unflappableness, to God. He's just unfazed by it. Like, I will use this and I will accomplish my end. The earth will be filled with my glory and the knowledge of me.
That should cause you to throw back to Genesis chapter 1 and 2, right? Remember, that's the intention of the Lord, is that the earth will be filled, right? Go fill the earth.
Right.
With the image of God, with the knowledge of the glory of God. That's the creation mandate right there. And you're saying that's going to happen. Dang.
Which is crazy, because he's saying this evil and wicked nation, both in their, him using them to discipline Judah, and ultimately in judging them, as he's saying here, is all going to be woven into this plan to spread his glory over the earth.
Right.
So, I mean, principially, there's no evil that can stop this plan from going forward. In fact, he'll weave it into the plan. He does that sort of, glory judo on it, that he uses its own weight against it to actually accomplish the plans.
Yeah. I think that's a wonderful picture of sovereignty. I think we have again here. It is a awe-inspiring, awe in the good way, not just awesome, like we throw around the word awesome, but of the Lord. That God is in the Lord, Yahweh is in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before him. And one of the ways he shuts people up is by, well, showing them how, by letting evil backfire on them. So God is the judge. God is sovereign. God knows how to judge people inherently in the evil as well as retributively through his wrath being roused, right? We use this name, we didn't talk about this here, but we learned that he is the Lord of hosts. That's that, whenever we see that Lord of hosts language in the Old Testament, that's Lord of plenty, God of armies.
Yeah, the
That's
military
another way to say that. Yeah, God of lots and lots. That's what it's saying. So we have this army being raised up, or this wicked nation. And God hasn't even flexed yet in the book. Let's talk about some principles, Brian, for us listeners. I mean, I think we should have a picture of awe when we think about God. Yeah. I think we should have a global view when we think about God's purpose. Maybe some other things how does this challenge us or comfort us?
Well, I think certainly, this has been such a consistent theme through the book. God's sovereignty is, I think he is sort of shaking Habakkuk with the bigness of his sovereignty. And I think there's a place that we should be shaken by the bigness of God's sovereignty. We should also be really comforted, by his sovereignty. Like, he's in his temple, he's ruling and reigning right from there. It's all under control. I think the other thing that it really reminds me of is that justice will be done, in the long run. And that, I think this is meant to comfort Habakkuk. It's meant to answer that question. Yeah, don't worry. It will be done at the exact right time. And so as we look at the world and we see injustice all over the place, to say, no, God didn't blink. God's not unaware of it. There is a plan, and it will get accomplished at the right time.
That's good. In other words, evil never escapes God's watching eyes, ever.
Which, you jump to the New Testament, Romans 12, and the application of that is, look, God is going to take vengeance.
So you don't have to do it.
You don't have to do it. In fact, you return good for evil. But that's your job. And that's, I just don't have to worry about justice.
And I think, Brian, one of the ways, now we don't go out as vigilantes, at least I don't think. If you were a vigilante, I wouldn't know, but let's say you don't. One of the ways that people, I think today, try to sort of even the scales, is on social media. Like, people try to actually literally correct all the wrongs of the world by posting stuff. And I'm not saying we should never post stuff or never speak up. Please don't misunderstand me. But there is a fortitude that comes for us that recognizes, listen, evil never escapes God's gaze.
Right.
And if people are being stupid in the world, or wicked people are prospering in the world, we can certainly call it out, but we should also have the fortitude to recognize that inherent in evil, it can't get very far.
Yeah.
Right. People who reject God and are idolaters or whatever, when you see someone going off the deep end, we can chill, actually. We can say the Lord knows what he's doing. And this we can come back to. The earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. That's the purpose of God. That's a Genesis purpose of God that is going to find its fulfillment. And all these pictures that we get of the Lord in the middle of judgment coming, it's just so refreshing and very, very much challenging. Yeah.
Yeah. Super good.